after the Flexbox properties for the Flex container, now I want to show you the properties that we use directly on the Flex items. So this is where we left off after the last lecture. Now let me just put this one here so it aligns item back to center. Okay, because now the first thing that I want to show you is the align self property. Okay, so we can come here to one of these items and then use align self. And remember what align self does? Well, basically it overrides the align contents property for one individual item. So right now the align items is set to center, okay? And so all these items here are now centered along the cross axis, right? So from top to bottom. But if we want to override that for one individual, let's say the number 4 here, we can say align self and put this one, for example, at the end. So flex end. And so now all the flex items except this one here are aligned to the center, so along the cross axis here, except for this one, which we set to flex end. And we can set it to flex start, of course. We can also set it to stretch, and that one is pretty useful. And we're going to see that one in the course. And so now this one is actually the same height as this one, because it's stretched in order to fill the entire container, which was defined by this element with the number 2. And so now the number 4 here has the same height. Okay, so let's just put it back to the end here. So flex end. All right, so that's the first one that I want to show you. And next we can play around with the order. So remember that the initial value of order is 0. And so if you want to put one of these elements here at the beginning, all we need to do is to put a value which is lower than 0. So let me show you how. So order -1. And now it will go here to the start. And so why is that? Well, Flexbox orders all of these elements according to their order number. And so this one has 0, 0, 0, and 0. So all of these have 0, but this one has -1. And so this is the one that has the lowest order. And since Flexbox starts ordering from the lowest order number, well, then of course this one here becomes the first, right? Now if you want to change this, and let's put another class here for the third one. So I3. If you want this one here to be the first one, then we can set this order to -2, for example. And now this one will be the one with the lowest order. And so it now comes here to the first position. Now we can also do this the other way around. So if we set this one to 1, then it's the one with the highest order. And so it moves here to the end. And so now we have -1, 0, 0, 0, 1. And we can use this even further if you wanted. So for example here order 2, and now this one would be the last, right? So that's how we use order. And that's actually pretty useful once more for responsive design in order to change position for some elements on a smaller or on a bigger screen, depending if we're using a mobile first or a desktop first strategy. All right, so that's order and align self. Now let's take a look at the last 3, which are flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So the first one that I want to show you is flex grow. And remember that flex grow is the ability of an element to grow. Okay? And what we do is to specify an integer. So just a number like we did in the order. So the first thing I want to do is to actually set flex on all the items, right? And so for that I can use here the item class. So flex grow 1, and take a look what happens now. All right, so all of them now occupy the entire space that they can. Or in other words, they grow as much as they can. So they're now occupying all the space they possibly can, right? And we can see that even better if we remove this margin here actually. Okay, and so now they're actually touching one another because again, they occupy all the space that they can. And that's what flex grow here does. Okay, so it gives items the ability to grow. Now if we set all of them to a higher number like 2 or 3 or even 23, it doesn't really matter because this number only matters in relation to other numbers. So let me actually give you an example of that. Okay, so I'm going to set these back to 1. Put this margin here back as well. But now what I'm going to do with this one here is to set flex grow to 2. And watch what happens now. You saw that? This element here is now double the size of these ones. And that's because 2 is double of 1. And so this one has twice the ability to grow than all the other flex items. And I can show you that even better by setting this, for example, to 3. And now it's 3 times bigger than the others. So flex grow, again, gives the element an ability to grow. Now remember that there's also a shorthand property which stands for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And so saying flex grow is actually the same thing as saying flex 1, okay? So a simple trick to expand a flex item to occupy as much width as it can is simply setting its flex property to 1, okay? Let me get rid of this now. And this one here as well. So let me show you what happens if I just set this on one of them. Let's say this one here, the last one. So flex 1. All right, and so now this one occupies all the space that it can, so all the available white space, and then the remaining flex items here, they just occupy the rest of the space. Okay, so that is flex grow. Now next up, I want to show you flex basis. Let's do it on this one here. Actually, and I can actually get rid of this one here. So flex basis. And now remember that with this one, we can set the width of a flex item. Okay, so instead of using the width property on a flex item, we usually use flex basis, right? So let's set it to 20%, for example. And here we go. So it's now 20% of the container. Then these other elements here, which basically have their flex basis set to auto, which is the initial value for flex basis. Okay, so this one here simply occupied the space that they need. And then all the remaining space is occupied by this last element here, because it flex set to 1. Okay, and now the one that's missing is flex shrink, okay? And in order to better show that to you, let's actually change this one here to a pixel-based value, okay? So let's say 300 pixels. Okay, and so now this one here has 300 pixels. Now take a look at what happens when I decrease the viewport width, okay? So just decreasing this window here. So you saw what happens? So again, the first thing of course that happens is that this element here grows smaller and smaller. That's because it has less and less space which it can occupy, and so of course it becomes smaller, right? Now as I further decrease this here, what starts to happen now? Well, you see that this element here also decreases, right? So even if we set its flex basis to 300 pixels, so basically we set the width to 300 pixels, it still starts decreasing when there's no more available space, okay? But sometimes that's not exactly what we want, okay? So we can actually change that using the flex shrink property, because remember, flex shrink controls how an element can shrink. So flex shrink. Now remember that flex shrink has the initial value of 1, okay? And so 1 means that the element is basically allowed to shrink, okay? And that's why we see this behavior here, where the element starts getting smaller and smaller as there's no more available space. Now, if we don't want this to happen, we simply set it to 0. And with that, the element is no longer allowed to shrink. So let's see that. And you see what happens now? These last elements simply get clipped, basically from the viewport. Or actually the viewport increases its width in order to fit these remaining elements. But what doesn't happen is that this element doesn't change its width because it's not allowed to shrink, okay? And so that's what we did here with flex shrink to 0. All right? Now, as I mentioned before, we should always use the flex property, okay? And so instead of having this, we just use the shorthand because that's the best practice. So flex. And now it's 0 for flex grow, right? Because we don't want this element to grow as much as it can, so occupying all the space it can. Then we also don't want it to shrink, and we want a flex basis of 300 pixels, for example. And so that's exactly the thing that we had before, okay? Let's convert this one here as well. Well, where is it? Oh, it's not here anymore, okay. So I already deleted. But what we usually want here is actually the 1. So usually we want the elements to be able to shrink, right? Because we don't want that situation where the elements no longer fit the container. Okay, and so That's the way it works now. And so with that, I showed you all of the properties that we can apply to a flex item. Now there's a lot more to learn, of course, and again, we're going to use all of this later in the project. And by then, you can see how we actually use all of these properties in real life situations. So this here is just a very small example, just to really show you how the properties work and that they exist. But as soon as we start the project, you will use these properties in the real life and everything will make a lot more sense to you.